My parents stood in the kitchen holding plane tickets. "We're leaving for a week. Don't call unless someone's dying." They returned to find their house was now a crime scene. The Uber driver kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror, at the blood soaking through the paper towel I had pressed against my 6-year-old brother's chin, at the 2-year-old screaming in my lap because her fever had spiked again somewhere between our driveway and the highway on-ramp. Beckett wasn't crying anymore, which scared me more than the crying had. He just kept saying, in this flat little voice, that his face felt cold, and I kept saying we're almost there, even though I had no idea if that was true because I'd never taken this route without an adult in the front seat. My hands were shaking so hard I couldn't get my phone unlocked to check the map. And Otto, 4 years old and strapped in the middle seat, kept asking why nobody's mommy was coming. I was 12. I had signed a hospital consent form an hour earlier with a signature that wasn't mine, tracing my mother's name from an old permission slip with my fingers shaking so badly, the E came out looking like a C. I didn't know yet that in 6 days I would watch 2 police officers put handcuffs on my mother in our own living room. I didn't know any of what was coming. I only knew that my brother's blood was on my hands and my parents were somewhere over the Gulf of Mexico with their phones in airplane mode. To understand how a 12-year-old ends up signing her mother's name in a hospital waiting room, you have to go back further than that week. Because that week wasn't really the beginning of anything. It was the place where 3 years of small, deniable decisions finally stopped being deniable. My parents, Grant and Carla Pruitt, had been taking trips without us since I was 9, always framed the same way, a reward they'd earned, a marriage that needed tending, and always landing on me the same way, a list taped to the refrigerator with feeding times and nap schedules written in my mother's tight, impatient handwriting. The first few trips were only 2 or 3 nights, and my grandmother Lucille, my dad's mother, used to come stay those nights, sleeping on our pull-out couch with her reading glasses pushed up into her hair, and those trips I don't remember being afraid of anything except running out of her favorite peppermint candies. Somewhere around the time Daisy was born, the trips got longer and Grandma stopped being invited to help, and nobody ever explained why. They just stopped mentioning her at all when they packed. I found out much later, sitting in a lawyer's office with my grandmother's hand gripping mine hard enough to hurt, that there had been an anonymous report filed with the county almost a full year before that week in the kitchen, made by a woman at my old daycare who'd noticed Otto showing up in the same clothes 3 days running and asking the front desk worker if he could sleep there instead of going home. That report went to an intake caseworker named Trent Ostby, who closed it within 48 hours as unsubstantiated after a phone call, not a home visit, a phone call, with my father. I only knew that when my mother handed me the schedule at the kitchen table, 3 color-coded columns for Otto, Beckett, and Daisy, with my name nowhere on any of them, like I was staff rather than a sister, something in my stomach already understood this trip was different from the others, even if I didn't have language yet for how. My mother set the tickets down on the counter like they were the only important object in the room and told me they were flying out of Portland the next morning, a week in the Florida Keys, and that under no circumstances was I to call unless, her exact words, someone was actually dying, because the last 3 vacations I had, in her telling, ruined with my drama. My father didn't even look up from his phone when he added that, if I couldn't handle a week of babysitting, maybe I wasn't mature enough for 8th grade in the fall, maybe I needed to be evaluated, a threat that wasn't new but still landed like it was, because the year before they had actually called the school counselor and told her I'd been having behavioral issues at home, a lie that got me pulled out of 2 classes for an assessment I never should have needed. I remember standing at that counter doing math in my head, 6 days, 1 me, 3 kids under 7, and feeling a specific kind of dread that had no bottom to it, the kind where you know something is wrong but you've been told so many times that your worry is the actual problem, that you start doubting the dread itself. They left at 6 the next morning without waking any of the little ones, and I stood in the doorway in my pajamas watching my father's rental car back down the driveway, my mother not looking back once, and I remember thinking, with a kind of dull 12-year-old logic, that 6 days wasn't that long, that I had survived worse weekends, that I could do this. I want to be honest that there is a version of me who still, years later, feels stupid for believing that, and a version of my therapist who has spent a lot of time telling me that a child believing her parents' promises is not stupidity, it's the only sane response to being 12. Daisy started throwing up at 5:50 that first morning. Before I'd even had coffee, I wasn't allowed to drink, and by the time I'd stripped the crib sheets and started the second load of laundry, my phone buzzed with a call from a number I didn't recognize at first, an area code from 3 states over, which turned out to be the hospital where my grandmother had gone in for what she'd thought was a routine scan. Grandma Lucille's voice on that first call was steadier than it would be on any call after it, but there was already something underneath it, A doctor had found a mass during imaging that was supposed to be checking her gallbladder, and they wanted to operate within the week. And she was scared, and she asked, so gently it almost broke something in me right there in the laundry room, whether I thought I could come sit with her before they wheeled her back. I told her I'd try. I hung up and called my father 4 times in a row, watched each call ring out and drop to voicemail, and on the 4th try, right as I was about to give up, he picked up, and his first words weren't hello. They were what part of "don't ruin our vacation" wasn't clear. I explained about the mass, about the surgery, about how scared she'd sounded, and he told me, in the same tone he'd used to correct a waiter's math on a check, that his mother was being dramatic, that she'd been fine her whole life and would be fine now. And then the call ended, and 20 minutes later a text arrived from my mother's number instead of a call, informing me that if I contacted them again about anything short of an actual emergency, they would tell the school I was too unstable for regular classes. The same threat, sharper now, like a blade they kept oiled for exactly this purpose. The next morning brought the first real crack in the version of events my parents would later try to tell in court, because that was the morning I discovered, scrolling numbly through Instagram while Daisy's fever sat at 101 and refused to move, a photo of my mother on a boat deck holding a champagne glass toward the sunset, the caption something about finally being free, no kids, no drama, just paradise, posted at 11:40 the night before, exactly 40 minutes after she had texted me a threat about ruining her vacation. I didn't understand yet how much that single photo would matter. Time-stamped, public, permanent, but some animal part of me screenshotted it anyway. Some instinct that had learned, without anyone teaching it, that someday somebody might need proof this had happened. Grandma's surgery got moved up that same afternoon, from Thursday to that day, because the surgeon had a cancellation and the mass had grown enough on a second scan that nobody wanted to wait. And she called me from a hospital bed sounding thinner than her voice had any right to sound over a phone line, crying in a way I had never once heard my grandmother cry, saying she was alone, that nobody from the family had come, that she didn't want to go into that operating room without someone from her own blood knowing where she was. I spent 40 minutes on the phone trying to find anyone who could watch 3 kids for even 2 hours so I could get a ride to a hospital 11 miles away, calling my friend Priya's older sister first, then the mother of a girl from my soccer team, both of whom said yes immediately and both of whom I had to call back and decline, because I remembered, too late, that my parents had blocked half the neighborhood's numbers the year before, furious that a mother down the street had once shown up unannounced with groceries after noticing our porch light out for 3 straight nights. By the 3rd day, I had stopped sleeping in any real sense, catching 20 minutes here and there propped against Daisy's crib while she cried through a fever that wouldn't fully break no matter how much children's Tylenol the bottle's chart said was safe for her weight. And I remember the specific, cold panic of realizing the bottle was almost empty, and I had $11 in a jar in my sock drawer, and no way to get to a store with 3 kids who couldn't walk that far. I tried the emergency line for County Family Services once, a number I found by Googling "Get Help Kids Home Alone at 11 at night" with Otto asleep against my shoulder, and the woman who answered, kind but rushed, told me that without an adult reporting a concern or a mandatory reporter flagging the household, there wasn't much they could open a file on based on a call from a minor describing her own situation, that I should tell a teacher or a trusted adult when school resumed. I hung up feeling like I'd knocked on a door that only opened from the other side, a feeling I would come to know so well over the following weeks that it eventually stopped even surprising me. The hospital called again on the 4th morning, before I'd managed to get any of the kids fed, and this time the voice on the line wasn't my grandmother's, it was a nurse, careful and professional in a way that still couldn't fully hide the concern underneath, explaining that the surgery had run into complications, that there'd been more bleeding than expected, that my grandmother was in recovery but asking for family, specifically asking for me, saying she had something she needed to tell me. I could hear her in the background, thin and frightened, asking the nurse why no one had come, and something in my chest folded in on itself in a way I didn't have words for yet. This specific shame of being 12 and being the only person who was trying and still not being enough. I called my father once more that morning, and this time it was my mother who answered his phone, her voice flat and final, telling me she was blocking my number right then, that I was a manipulative little brat trying to guilt-trip them, that I was the reason their life felt hard. And then the line went dead and stayed dead, no dial tone, just the small, merciless silence of a call that has actually ended. It was later that same day, a little after 2 in the afternoon, when Beckett went over the handlebars of his bike in the driveway and split his chin open wide enough that I could see something pale and glistening underneath, that I understood, with a lurch, was probably bone. I remember pressing a dish towel to his face with one hand and calling an Uber with the other, my fingers so slick with adrenaline the app kept mistyping the address, and loading all 3 kids into a stranger's back seat because there was no one else. No car of my own, no adult I was allowed to call, nothing but a driver named Dimitri who kept the radio off the whole ride once he understood what was happening and drove faster than the speed limit without me having to ask. The ER intake nurse, a woman with kind eyes and a clipboard, asked where my parents were, and I told her they were parking, a lie I'd rehearsed in my head somewhere around exit 14, and she looked at me a beat too long before she let it go, the way adults sometimes do when believing you is easier than what not believing you would require of them. That was the day I forged my mother's signature for the second time, on a consent form for the stitches, 7 of them, my hand shaking so badly the loop of the P didn't close. By the 5th day, I had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch in what felt like a lifetime, and the hospital called one final time to say my grandmother had taken a turn overnight, that her numbers were unstable, that if there was any family who could come, now was the time, and that she was asking for me specifically, that she'd said she had something important she needed me to know before anything else happened. I remember sliding down the pantry door onto the kitchen floor with the phone still pressed to my ear, sobbing in a way that scared Otto so badly he started crying too, and Daisy, sensing something in the air even at 2 years old, wailing along with both of us, and Beckett, 7 stitches and a butterfly bandage on his chin, trying to hug all 3 of us at once like he could hold the whole collapsing morning together with his small arms. That is the exact moment my English teacher Priya Nandan knocked on our front door, sent by the school after 3 unexplained absences in a row, a policy I would later learn existed specifically because kids sometimes vanish from school for reasons that have nothing to do with the flu. Ms. Nandan did not raise her voice once. She walked into a kitchen with a crying toddler, a 6-year-old with visible stitches, a 4-year-old who hadn't been fed since breakfast, and a 12-year-old collapsed against the pantry door, and she knelt down to my eye level and asked, very quietly, how long this had been going on, and something in me that had been holding a dam together for 5 days simply gave out. I showed her my phone, the blocked number, the champagne glass photo, the parasailing photo posted that same morning, with a caption about living their best life, and a hashtag, Kids Free Week, that I still cannot fully explain to anyone who wasn't there, the specific vertigo of seeing your own abandonment turned into a joke for strangers to like. Ms. Nandan sat with me on that kitchen floor for a long moment before she took out her own phone, and she said my name, gently, and told me she was going to make a call, that none of this was my fault, and I want to be clear that I did not believe her yet. Not really. Because 5 days of being told I was the problem is a hard thing to unlearn in one sentence from a teacher standing in your kitchen. What Ms. Nandan actually did next, I only pieced together weeks later from a case file Malcolm, our eventual family attorney, walked me through page by page. She called the county's after-hours child welfare line and, because she was a mandatory reporter with a name and a badge number attached to her statement, the call was routed differently than mine had been 3 nights earlier, flagged for immediate response rather than a callback in the morning. Within 40 minutes, a caseworker named Deborah Kessling arrived at our house with a folder already thicker than I expected. And it was Deborah, not me, who first said out loud the sentence that would define the next 6 months of my life, that this pattern, unsupervised minors, documented medical neglect, a prior report on file that had never received a home visit, met the threshold for emergency removal pending investigation. I remember feeling something that wasn't quite relief, because relief implies safety, and what I actually felt sitting on our living room couch answering Deborah's questions was closer to the sensation of finally being allowed to put down something heavy. After holding it so long, my arms had gone numb to the weight. Deborah brought in a detective the following morning, a soft-spoken man named Callum Bishara from the county's Family Crimes Unit, and it was Detective Bishara who first pulled the thread that unraveled the older report, the one from the daycare worker a year earlier, the one Trent Ostby had closed without ever setting foot in our house. Bishara requested the original file as part of building a pattern of neglect case, standard procedure he only had to explain to me once before I understood it well enough to follow the rest without re-explanation, and what came back made even Deborah go quiet reading it at our kitchen table. Trent Ostby's closure notes cited a phone conversation with, quote, the child's father, a family friend, who assured the caseworker the report was retaliatory, filed by a disgruntled former daycare employee, and the notes closed with a line that Bishara read aloud twice like he couldn't quite believe it the first time. No further action warranted. Family known to reporting caseworker. It turned out Trent Ostby and my father had gone to the same high school 20 years earlier, played on the same baseball team, still exchanged Christmas cards. That single sentence in an old case file meant a full year of what happened in our house. The year Otto learned to lock himself in the bathroom when voices got loud. the year I started keeping a granola bar in my backpack in case dinner didn't happen, had been reviewed and dismissed by a man who knew my father's name before he'd ever heard mine. Dr. Farah Solis, a child psychologist Deborah brought in to evaluate all four of us over the following week, was the first adult who asked me questions and then actually waited long enough in the silence after them for a true answer to surface, instead of the rehearsed one I'd give a stranger by reflex. She documented what she called, in careful clinical language I later read in her report, evidence of parentification and chronic hypervigilance in the eldest child, alongside developmental concerns in the 4-year-old consistent with prolonged unmet needs, and malnutrition markers in the 2-year-old that were mild but real, mild being a word I hated the second I read it, because nothing about that week had felt mild while I was living inside it. She also, gently, asked me about my grandmother, and it was in that conversation, sitting across from her in an office with a fish tank bubbling in the corner like this was a normal kind of appointment, that I finally cried the way I hadn't let myself cry in front of Deborah or Bashara, or even Ms. Nandan, because Dr. Solis was the first person who asked not what happened, but how scared I had been, as its own separate question, deserving its own separate answer. There was one strange, quiet good afternoon in the middle of that week, and I want to hold on to it here because it mattered even though what came after nearly erased it. Grandma Lucille, stable now, still in a hospital bed but breathing on her own and talking in full sentences again, had a nurse named Odalise wheel a landline phone over so she could call the house, and when Deborah put me on the line, my grandmother's voice cracked with something that wasn't fear this time, and she told me she was proud of me, that whatever happened next, I had done exactly the right thing, and for about 6 minutes I let myself believe the worst part might genuinely be over. Then, that same evening, our home phone rang once, a blocked number, and when I picked it up there was 3 full seconds of breathing, then a click, no voice, no message, and Deborah, standing right there in our kitchen, wrote the timestamp down in her notepad without saying whether she thought it meant anything, which somehow felt worse than if she'd said it clearly did. That wasn't the only moment that week where the ground shifted under something I'd thought was settled. 2 days after Ms. Nandan's visit, a car I didn't recognize sat idling at the curb across from our house for almost 40 minutes, and it was our elderly neighbor, Mr. Delacroix, who noticed it first from his porch and came over to ask, carefully, whether I knew whose it was, whether my parents had asked anyone to keep an eye on the place while they were gone. I didn't know then, and I still don't fully know now whether that car belonged to someone connected to my father, a friend doing a favor, checking whether the kids had actually called anyone, or whether it was nothing at all, a contractor scoping a house down the block, a stranger on his lunch break. Detective Bashara looked into it after the fact and came back with nothing conclusive, no plate match to anyone in my parents' circle, and told me some things in a case like this simply stay unresolved, which is a sentence I've had to make peace with more than once since. Mr. Delacroix became, in his own quiet way, one of the steadiest presences of that entire week, a widower in his 70s who'd lived across the street since before I was born, and who, it turned out, had noticed far more over the years than any of us realized. The trash cans that sat unemptied for 2 weeks at a stretch. The times he'd seen me walking Otto to the bus stop in the rain without a coat because I hadn't been able to find his in time. He gave a statement to Bashara that week, describing 3 separate occasions over the previous year when he'd considered calling someone himself and talked himself out of it, not wanting to overstep. A sentence that Deborah later told me she'd heard from 100 different neighbors in 100 different cases. The good, decent hesitation that so often lets a bad situation run 1 more year longer than it should have. By the time my parents' plane landed back in Portland on the 7th day, tanned and loose-limbed and laughing about something on the drive home from the airport, according to the account they'd later give under oath, none of the 6 missed calls, texts, or voicemails from Deborah's office over those final 48 hours had reached them, because my mother's phone, they claimed, had been left in airplane mode the entire flight home for battery reasons, a detail Assistant District Attorney Ingrid Avery would later describe in court, dryly, as a remarkably convenient coincidence for 2 people about to walk into their own driveway and find it lined with 2 unmarked cars, a marked police cruiser, and Miss Nandan's sedan parked crookedly at the curb where she'd stayed, unwilling to leave until she saw this through to whatever it became. I wasn't in the house when they actually walked in. Deborah had taken the 4 of us to a county intake office that morning as a precaution, but I got the account later, first from Deborah's report and eventually, in far more detail, from Detective Bashara himself, who told me he'd never forget the exact look on my mother's face. My father set his duty-free bag down on the entry table like he still lived in a version of that house where such gestures meant something, and demanded to know what was going on, and my mother, still wearing a paper resort bracelet on her wrist, looked at the two CPS staff and the uniformed officer standing in her living room and, according to 3 separate written statements that all matched almost word for word, smiled, an actual smile, and said, "Thank God. I'm so tired of pretending I wanted this," gesturing loosely toward where the kids' shoes were lined up by the door. "Take them." Deborah's report noted that my father's expression shifted in real time from confusion to something closer to fury. Not at what had happened to us, but at the fact that it had been discovered. And it was into that exact silence that Officer Renwick, the uniformed officer on scene, stepped forward and told my mother she was under arrest for child endangerment resulting in bodily harm. A charge that would eventually be amended and expanded once Ingrid Avery's office finished pulling together the timeline, the ER records for Beckett's stitches, the pediatric neglect findings from Dr. Solis, the photographs, the blocked calls, the original unopened report with Trent Ostby's name at the bottom of it. My mother's smile, according to every account I've heard, vanished the moment the handcuffs actually touched her wrists, replaced by a single furious question: for what? A mom can't go on vacation anymore. As if the 6 days that had actually happened in that house were simply a technicality standing between her and her right to leave it. I want to be honest about the part of that week I don't like admitting even now, because a story like this can start to sound clean in the retelling. And it wasn't clean, not for a long time. 3 weeks into the investigation, sitting in Malcolm's office going over a timeline of exhibits, texts, photographs, medical bills totaling just under $6,000 between Beckett's stitches and Daisy's 2 urgent care visits, I had a moment where something in me simply broke. Not loudly. I didn't scream or cry. I just went completely still and told Malcolm I wanted to recant everything, tell everyone I'd exaggerated, that my parents deserved a chance, because some old, deep 12-year-old part of me was more afraid of being the reason my family fell apart than I was of anything that had actually happened in that house. Malcolm didn't argue with me. He just sat there while I shook, and eventually asked me, quietly, whether I remembered forging my mother's name on a hospital form because there was no one else who could, and something about hearing it said back to me, plainly, without judgment, let the panic finally drain out of my body, instead of staying locked inside it. The custody hearing itself, 6 weeks later, was less dramatic than the arrest and somehow harder to sit through, because it was in that gray, procedural room that the full shape of what my parents had built over 3 years finally got read into the record in one continuous document. Ingrid Avery walked the judge through the Trent Ostby report first, then the champagne photograph time-stamped 40 minutes after a threat text, then the parasailing caption posted while a nurse in another state was asking a 12-year-old to please come say goodbye to her grandmother, then the medical bills, then Dr. Solis's clinical findings on all 3 younger children, presented not as a story but as an exhibit list, each one numbered, each one entered, and it was somewhere around Exhibit 11 that I understood this wasn't really about me convincing anyone of anything anymore. The evidence had simply outrun any version of events my parents could still tell. My grandmother testified 2 days into the hearing, walking slowly, still recovering, refusing a wheelchair despite Dr. Solis's raised eyebrow, and she told the court something none of us had known, that she had gone to a lawyer of her own 18 months earlier, quietly, without telling my father, to ask what it would take to petition for guardianship of the grandchildren, and had been talked out of filing by that same lawyer, who worried a guardianship petition without documented evidence would look retaliatory and only make things harder for everyone, especially me. Hearing that in open court felt like a small, specific kind of grief. The discovery that someone had seen the danger a year and a half before Ms. Nandon ever knocked on our door, and had chosen, out of caution rather than cruelty, to wait, and that waiting had cost us all a year and a half we didn't get back. Trent Ostby was placed on administrative leave the week Bishara's findings became part of the public record, and the county opened its own internal review into the closed report, though as of the last update Deborah gave me, that review has never produced any public findings, no firing, no formal discipline that I've ever seen documented anywhere. I think about that more than I'd like to. The fact that a man who closed a file because he recognized a friend's name on it is, as far as I know, still working somewhere in that same system today, deciding in some other house, for some other kid, whether a phone call from a father he trusts outweighs whatever a stranger tried to report. That's a sentence I don't have an ending for. I've made a kind of peace with not having one. My mother pleaded no contest to 2 counts of child endangerment and 1 count of medical neglect, receiving 18 months of supervised probation, mandatory parenting classes, and a permanent finding against her in the state's child welfare registry, while my father, facing lesser charges tied primarily to the forged consent issue he'd been aware I'd had to resort to and done nothing to prevent, accepted a plea that kept him out of jail but cost him his job at the county parks department once the story, Picked up eventually by a local reporter named Yusuf Kanan who'd been following Deborah's office on an unrelated story and stumbled into ours, ran with both their names attached. Neither of them has custody of any of us now. That part of the case did resolve, cleanly, permanently, in a way so much else in this story didn't. We live with Grandma Lucille now, in the same house with the pull-out couch I used to sleep on as a little kid during her old 2-night visits. Except now it's a real bedroom, mine, with a door that locks from the inside, which she installed herself the week we moved in without either of us ever discussing why it mattered so much to both of us that it be there. Otto still, 3 years later, checks that the front door is locked twice before bed, a habit Dr. Solis says may never fully go away, and that we've both simply learned to let him have. Beckett has a scar along his chin that's faded to a thin white line most people don't notice unless he points it out, which he does sometimes. To new friends, matter of fact, like it's just a fact about his face rather than a map of the worst week of both our lives. Daisy, 5 now, doesn't remember any of it, and some days I think that's the only clean mercy this whole story managed to produce.